A millionaire humiliated his housekeeper in front of guests. What she did next left him in tears. The Aldridge estate was a monument to power and privilege, perched on a sprawling hill in the heart of Ravenswood Estates. Its grandiose columns and perfectly manicured lawns whispered of generational wealth that seemed untouchable. To outsiders, the mansion was a dream, a beacon of elegance and influence. But to those within its walls, the Aldridge family's picture-perfect exterior hid fractures that ran deep. Clara Hastings, the housekeeper, knew this better than anyone. Clara had worked for the Aldridges for a little over a year, quietly navigating the currents of their tumultuous lives. She was a presence barely acknowledged, her existence confined to the edges of their gilded world. Her uniform, a crisp black dress and white apron, marked her as part of the furniture, invisible to the people she served. But Clara was anything but insignificant. She observed everything, and in the silence of her unnoticed presence, she was gathering a story far bigger than anyone in the house could imagine. That evening, the Aldridges were hosting one of their famous galas, a glittering affair that brought the city's elite through the estate's iron gates. The ballroom was alive with laughter and the tinkling of glasses, the soft hum of a string quartet floating through the air. Women in jewel-toned gowns glided across the floor, their laughter high and deliberate, while men in tailored suits exchanged hushed words over bourbon and cigars. Victoria Aldridge, the matriarch, moved among the guests like a queen surveying her court. Her diamonds sparkled against the deep green silk of her gown, and her sharp eyes missed nothing, or so she thought. Clara noticed the way Victoria's smile faltered ever so slightly when her gaze landed on Charles Aldridge, her husband, engaged in a too intimate conversation with a younger woman by the bar. Clara's lips twitched in the faintest hint of amusement before she smoothed her expression into practiced neutrality. Clara. Victoria's voice cut through the music like a blade. Clara, who had been arranging champagne flutes on a silver tray, straightened instantly. She turned toward her employer, her face calm, as though she hadn't just witnessed Victoria's moment of weakness. "Yes, Mrs. Aldridge," Clara replied, stepping forward with measured precision. "The champagne on table 7 has been empty for 10 minutes. Victoria snapped, her tone dripping with irritation. "Do try to keep up." "Of course, Mrs. Aldridge," Clara said, dipping her head in deference. She moved swiftly toward the table, her steps light and efficient. As she passed, snippets of conversation reached her ears. Rumors of a company acquisition, a whispered complaint about the governor's latest policy. These moments, seemingly trivial to others, were treasures to Clara. She tucked them away in the recesses of her mind, where they joined countless other observations. By the time Clara reached the bar, her expression had shifted into something unreadable. She poured the champagne with steady hands, her eyes scanning the room as she worked. There was something almost predatory about her gaze, not in an aggressive sense, but in its intensity. She saw things others didn't, catching fleeting looks, whispered words, and the subtle shifts in body language that betrayed hidden motives. At table 7, the eldest Aldridge son, Matthew, leaned back in his chair with the ease of someone who had never known rejection. His dark hair was impeccably styled, his tailored suit framing his athletic build. He was engaged in conversation with the senator's daughter, his signature smirk firmly in place as he leaned closer to her. Clara approached the table, her movements deliberate and silent. Neither Matthew nor his companion noticed her until she began refilling their glasses. "Ah, Clara," Matthew drawled, barely glancing at her. "Make sure we don't run out of this vintage, will you? It's the only decent thing being served tonight." Clara gave a polite nod, suppressing the urge to roll her eyes. "Yes, Mr. Aldridge, of course." As she turned to leave, she caught the senator's daughter giving her a fleeting look of pity, as though Clara's role in the household was something to be pitied. It didn't bother her. Clara was used to being underestimated. In fact, she preferred it. Being invisible gave her access to things no one else could see. Back in the kitchen, the staff moved like clockwork, their actions precise and coordinated. Clara placed the empty tray on the counter and checked her pocket watch. It was almost 9, peak chaos in the ballroom. She stepped away from the noise, retreating to the servants' corridor for a moment of quiet. From her pocket, she pulled a small leather notebook, its cover worn and corners frayed. Flipping it open, she began jotting notes in neat, deliberate handwriting. Victoria Aldridge, tension with Charles, possible marital issues. Matthew Aldridge, discussing private partnership deal with senator's daughter. Intentions unclear. Charles Aldridge, behavior growing reckless. Potential infidelity? Her pen paused, the faintest smile curving her lips. The notebook was more than a collection of observations. It was a weapon in the making. Every line, every detail, was part of a larger picture. One that would expose the Aldridges and others like them for what they truly were. Clara had entered this household under the guise of servitude, but her real purpose was far more deliberate. She wasn't just a housekeeper, she was a best-selling author. Under a pseudonym, she had penned novels that delved into the dark underbelly of the elite, stories so vivid and precise that readers assumed they were fictional. What they didn't know was that every word was grounded in truth. "Clara," a voice called, breaking her thoughts. She snapped the notebook shut and tucked it away before stepping back into the kitchen. The head butler, Mr. Nolan, frowned as he approached her. "Mrs. Aldridge wants you to oversee the dessert presentation. Make sure nothing goes wrong." "Understood," Clara said, falling seamlessly back into her role. She moved quickly, her mind already cataloging what she had observed that evening. Every interaction, every word, would find its place in her growing manuscript. As the night wore on, Clara's work continued without a hitch. She moved like a ghost through the ballroom, her presence unnoticed yet essential. Guests continued to indulge, their laughter growing louder as the champagne flowed freely. Clara watched it all, her sharp mind piecing together the web of secrets that surrounded her. By midnight, the gala was winding down. Guests began to trickle out, their farewells filled with exaggerated warmth. Clara stood at the edge of the room, her hands clasped neatly in front of her. Victoria Aldridge caught her eye from across the room, her expression unreadable. Clara held her gaze for a moment, then dipped her head in a subtle nod before disappearing into the shadows. As the last guest departed and the house fell silent, Clara made her way to her small attic room. She lit a single lamp and pulled out her notebook, the events of the evening still fresh in her mind. With deliberate care, she began writing, her pen scratching softly against the paper. The Aldridges were crumbling, their pristine image cracking under the weight of their secrets. Clara would make sure the world saw them for what they truly were. But not yet. For now, she would wait, biding her time until the moment was right. Did you see that twist? What do you think? What would you do if you were Clara, stuck in the middle of such a high-stakes game? Drop your thoughts in the comments below. We'd love to hear your take on this story. And if you haven't yet, make sure to like the video and subscribe to our channel for more gripping stories like this one. You won't want to miss what's coming next. The Aldridge mansion awoke each morning like clockwork. By 6 a.m., the staff moved swiftly through the halls, preparing for another day of maintaining the pristine image of the family they served. The scent of freshly brewed coffee mixed with the faint aroma of wax polish as Clara Hastings folded a set of linens in the servants' quarters. The soft hum of activity around her was routine, but her mind, as always, was elsewhere. Clara folded with precision, her movements practiced and efficient. Yet, the mundane task served only as a backdrop to the thoughts swirling in her head. She had spent the last year documenting every nuance of the Aldridge family's dysfunction, every crack in the foundation of their immaculate facade. To the world, the Aldridges were untouchable, symbols of wealth, elegance, and influence. But Clara knew the truth. She had seen it in the moments no one else noticed. The way Victoria clenched her jaw when Charles brushed past her without a word, the thinly veiled disdain in Matthew's tone when addressing his mother. The family's world was polished to perfection, but beneath it lay decay. That morning, Clara's routine was interrupted by the sharp staccato of heels on the marble floor. Victoria Aldridge swept into the kitchen, her emerald green silk robe fluttering behind her. Her presence was commanding, even in the informal hours of the day. The room fell silent as the staff turned their attention to her, each anticipating her demands. "Clara," Victoria said, her tone clipped. She barely glanced at the other staff as she addressed the housekeeper. You'll accompany me to the city this afternoon. There's a luncheon at the club, and I'll need assistance." Clara inclined her head. "Of course, Mrs. Aldridge." Victoria didn't wait for a response, already pivoting on her heel to leave. Clara watched her go, noting the tension in her shoulders and the tightness around her mouth. She was masking something, though Clara wasn't yet sure what. Later that morning, as she ironed Victoria's outfit for the day, a sleek Chanel dress in deep navy, Clara's thoughts wandered to the notebook tucked away in her room. It was growing fuller by the day, its pages crowded with observations and musings. She had noted everything from Charles's questionable phone calls to Matthew's increasing interest in the family's financial holdings. The Aldridge world, which appeared seamless from the outside, was showing fractures, and Clara was there to document every one. By the time the car arrived to take Victoria to the city, Clara was ready, standing by the door with a leather tote slung over her shoulder. Victoria swept past her without acknowledgement, her chin held high as she slid into the sleek black town car. Clara followed, settling into the seat across from her employer. The ride into Manhattan was silent, save for the faint hum of the car's engine. Victoria scrolled through her phone, her manicured fingers tapping rapidly against the screen. Clara watched her discreetly, her eyes sharp and calculating. Victoria's lips were pressed into a thin line, her jaw tight. Something was clearly bothering her, but Clara knew better than to ask. When they arrived at the country club, Victoria stepped out with a practiced elegance, her every movement exuding authority. Clara followed a few paces behind, carrying a small bag with Victoria's essentials. The luncheon was a meticulously arranged affair, with rows of white-clothed tables adorned with centerpieces of pale pink roses. The guests were a collection of Manhattan's elite, socialites, philanthropists, and wives of prominent businessmen. Clara stayed on the periphery, her role that of a silent observer. She watched as Victoria navigated the room, exchanging pleasantries with other women who looked just like her, poised, polished, and ruthless. It was a game of appearances, Clara realized, with each woman vying for dominance under the guise of friendly conversation. "Victoria," one of the women said, her voice carrying just enough volume to ensure nearby ears caught her words. "I heard about Charles's little misstep at the fundraiser last week. How are you holding up?" Clara saw the flicker of anger that flashed across Victoria's face before she quickly replaced it with a measured smile. "We're perfectly fine, Lydia," she said smoothly, her tone laced with subtle condescension. "You know how rumors are in this town." Lydia laughed lightly, but the glint in her eyes told Clara she had no intention of letting the matter drop. The exchange was brief, but it was enough to confirm what Clara already suspected. The cracks in the Aldridges' marriage were beginning to show. As the luncheon wore on, Clara busied herself with small tasks, keeping Victoria's drink filled and ensuring her seating arrangements remained untouched. But her focus never wavered from the conversations around her. She caught snippets of gossip, each fragment adding to the mosaic of truths and lies she was piecing together. By the time they returned to the mansion, the sun was setting, casting long shadows across the estate. Victoria dismissed Clara with a curt nod, disappearing into her private quarters without another word. Clara watched her retreating figure, noting the slump in her shoulders that she had so carefully hidden all day. That evening, as Clara sat in her small attic room, she opened her notebook once again. The events of the day played back in her mind, each detail sharpening as she committed it to paper. Victoria Aldridge, strained interactions with Lydia St. James, possible rumors circulating about Charles. Matthew Aldridge, unusual interest in family finances. Potential power play? Clara paused, her pen hovering over the page. She thought back to the drive home, to the tension radiating off Victoria like heat. There was more to the story, Clara was certain. Victoria's mask of control was slipping, and Clara intended to be there when it fell. As she closed her notebook, Clara's gaze shifted to the window. The lights of the mansion glittered in the distance, each one a reminder of the world she was infiltrating. The Aldridges thought themselves untouchable, their secrets buried beneath layers of wealth and influence. But Clara had seen the truth. She was peeling back the layers, one by one, and what she found beneath was both fascinating and damning. The night stretched on, and the estate grew quiet. Clara sat at her desk, her pen moving steadily across the page. The Aldridge family's polished veneer was cracking, and Clara was determined to expose what lay beneath. The atmosphere inside the Aldridge mansion was growing heavier by the day, though no one in the family dared acknowledge it. Tensions that had once simmered just beneath the surface were beginning to bubble over, their effects reverberating through the grand halls. For Clara Hastings, the housekeeper, the shift was palpable. She moved through the house with her usual quiet efficiency, but her sharp eyes missed nothing. That morning, the sky outside the estate was a slate gray, the air thick with the promise of rain. Clara stood in the library, dusting the rows of leather-bound books that lined the walls. The room, with its towering shelves and rich mahogany paneling, was Charles Aldridge's domain. He often spent his mornings here, poring over financial documents or taking calls that Clara suspected were best kept private. Today, however, the room was empty. She paused, her hand hovering over a framed photograph on the desk. It was a picture of the Aldridge family, taken years ago. Charles stood at the center, his arm wrapped around Victoria's slender waist, while their two children, Matthew and Lila, smiled stiffly on either side. Clara studied their faces, noting how time had hardened them. The smiles were all for show, masks that hid the cracks she had come to know so well. Her thoughts were interrupted by the sound of raised voices echoing from the hallway. Clara straightened, her instincts immediately on alert. She set down the feather duster and moved toward the door, careful to keep her steps light. Peering out, she saw Matthew and Victoria standing near the staircase, their argument escalating. "You're being reckless," Victoria hissed, her voice low but sharp. "Do you have any idea how this will look if it gets out?" Matthew, tall and broad-shouldered, leaned against the banister with an air of defiance. "Oh, please," he said, his tone dripping with disdain. "You're one to talk about appearances. Half the city already knows about your little feud with Lydia St. James." Victoria's face darkened, her composure slipping. "Don't turn this around on me, Matthew. You're the one jeopardizing this family with your idiotic schemes." Clara stepped back, her heart quickening. She didn't dare linger too long. Being caught eavesdropping would only invite trouble. But as she returned to her work, her mind raced. What was Matthew up to? And why was Victoria so desperate to keep it hidden? By mid-afternoon, the rain had begun to fall, a steady patter against the mansion's tall windows. Clara found herself in the kitchen, helping the staff prepare for an intimate dinner party Victoria had planned for the evening. The guest list was small, but the pressure to ensure perfection was immense. Victoria's reputation demanded it. "Clara, can you check the seating arrangements in the dining room?" asked Mr. Nolan, the head butler, his tone brisk. "Mrs. Aldridge is particular about the placements." "Of course," Clara replied, wiping her hands on her apron before heading to the dining room. The table was a masterpiece, set with crystal glasses and silver candlesticks that gleamed under the chandelier's soft light. Clara moved around the table, adjusting place cards and ensuring the cutlery was perfectly aligned. As she worked, she noticed something unusual, a folded piece of paper tucked beneath one of the plates. Curiosity tugged at her, but Clara hesitated. She glanced around the room, ensuring she was alone, before carefully retrieving the note. Unfolding it, she saw a single sentence scrawled in a hurried hand. "He knows more than he should. Handle it." Clara's brow furrowed as she studied the note. The message was vague, but the implications were clear. It was meant for someone in the house, and it wasn't an invitation to a pleasant conversation. She quickly refolded the paper and slipped it into her pocket, her pulse quickening. Someone was playing a dangerous game, and Clara intended to find out who. As the evening wore on, the dinner party unfolded with all the grace and elegance one would expect of the Aldridges. Victoria was the perfect hostess, her laughter light and musical as she entertained her guests. Charles, meanwhile, was subdued, his focus shifting between his glass of bourbon and the conversation around him. Clara moved through the room with practiced ease, refilling glasses and clearing plates as needed. Her thoughts, however, were elsewhere. The note weighed heavily in her pocket, its cryptic message gnawing at her curiosity. She kept her eyes on the guests, searching for any sign of tension or unusual behavior. It wasn't long before she found it. Matthew, seated near the head of the table, was unusually quiet. His usual bravado was muted, his gaze darting occasionally to Charles, who sat opposite him. There was something unspoken between them, a tension that thickened the air. Clara's instincts told her that whatever was written in the note had something to do with them. After the last course was served and the guests began to mingle in the drawing room, Clara excused herself to the servants' quarters. She pulled the note from her pocket, reading it again. Her mind raced through the possibilities. Who had written it? And what, exactly, did they know? Clara's thoughts were interrupted by the sound of footsteps approaching. She quickly tucked the note away and turned to see Lila Aldridge standing in the doorway. The youngest of the Aldridge children, Lila was a quiet presence in the household, often overshadowed by her brother's larger-than-life personality. Tonight, however, she seemed troubled. "Clara," Lila said softly, her voice barely above a whisper. "Can I talk to you?" Clara nodded, gesturing for Lila to step inside. She closed the door behind her, giving them privacy. "What's on your mind, Miss Lila?" Lila hesitated, wringing her hands nervously. "Something's not right," she said finally. "Matthew's been acting strange lately. He's secretive." Clara's interest piqued, but she kept her expression neutral. "In what way?" "He's always on his phone, whispering into it like he doesn't want anyone to hear. And last week, I overheard him arguing with someone over money." Lila's voice trembled slightly, her anxiety clear. "I think he's hiding something big." Clara placed a reassuring hand on Lila's shoulder. "Thank you for telling me," she said gently. "I'll keep an eye on things." Lila nodded, relief flashing across her face. "Just be careful, Clara. If something happens, I don't know what I'd do." As Lila left, Clara's resolve hardened. Whatever Matthew was involved in, it was serious enough to worry his sister, and Clara had no intention of ignoring it. Later that night, as the mansion settled into quiet, Clara sat in her small attic room, her notebook open on the desk. She carefully added the new details, her pen moving with deliberate strokes. Matthew Aldridge, secretive behavior, possible financial trouble. Tension with Charles increasing. Note found in dining room, intended to silence someone. Writer unknown. Clara leaned back in her chair, her gaze falling on the window. The rain had stopped, but the clouds remained, casting a heavy shadow over the estate. The Aldridge family was a web of secrets, each thread tangled with another. Clara was determined to untangle them all. As she closed her notebook, she felt a flicker of anticipation. The web was tightening, and soon, the truth would come to light. But for now, she would wait, biding her time as the pieces fell into place. The storm hit the Aldridge estate late in the evening, sheets of rain pounding against the windows and lightning carving jagged streaks through the sky. Inside the mansion, the mood was no less turbulent. Clara Hastings moved silently through the halls, her steps muted against the thick Persian rugs. While the storm outside howled, the real tempest was brewing within these gilded walls. Dinner had been a tense affair. Charles Aldridge had arrived late, his face shadowed with something heavier than exhaustion. Victoria had greeted him with icy civility, her carefully measured smiles doing little to mask the fire in her eyes. Across the table, Matthew sat with his usual air of smug indifference, but Clara, watching from the shadows, saw the way his hands clenched around his wineglass, his knuckles white. By the time the family retreated to their respective corners of the house, Clara had pieced together enough fragments of conversation to confirm her suspicions. The Aldridges were teetering on the edge of chaos. The cracks that had been forming for months were widening, and it was only a matter of time before they gave way entirely. As the storm raged outside, Clara retreated to the library under the pretense of tidying up. It was a room she had come to favor, not for its grandeur but for its secrets. The bookshelves, stacked with tomes that Charles rarely touched, often concealed papers and ledgers left behind in careless moments. Tonight, Clara wasn't disappointed. On the desk, partially hidden beneath a stack of newspapers, was a folder marked "Confidential." She hesitated, her heart pounding. Her instinct screamed caution, but curiosity was a powerful force. Glancing over her shoulder to ensure she was alone, Clara opened the folder. Inside were financial documents, spreadsheets detailing transactions that, to the untrained eye, might seem innocuous. But Clara wasn't untrained. Her years as an author, crafting intricate plots and unraveling characters' motives, had sharpened her analytical mind. One name stood out: Matthew Aldridge. Over and over, it appeared alongside sums of money that didn't align with anything she'd seen in the household budget. The numbers hinted at offshore accounts, discreetly funneled funds, and debts far larger than any gambling habit could explain. She was so engrossed that she almost missed the sound of footsteps approaching. Clara quickly slid the folder back into its place and picked up a nearby feather duster, feigning work as the door creaked open. Matthew stepped inside, his silhouette briefly illuminated by a flash of lightning. "What are you doing here?" he asked, his voice sharper than usual. His eyes narrowed as they fell on her. Clara kept her expression neutral. "Just tidying up, Mr. Aldridge. The storm is making the house feel damp." Matthew's gaze lingered on her for a moment, his suspicion evident. Then, with a dismissive wave, he moved to the liquor cabinet. Clara kept her eyes down as he poured himself a generous glass of whiskey, but she couldn't miss the tension radiating from him. "Make sure this room is spotless by morning," he said curtly, before turning and leaving without another word. Clara waited until his footsteps faded before exhaling. She had been careful, but she knew Matthew was not someone to underestimate. Whatever secrets he was keeping, they were dangerous enough to make him paranoid. And if he suspected her of prying, the consequences could be severe. The following morning, the storm had cleared, but the unease in the house remained. Clara went about her duties as usual, her movements deliberate and unhurried. She could feel the weight of Matthew's gaze as he passed her in the hallway, a silent reminder that he hadn't forgotten their encounter in the library. But Clara had other concerns. The folder she had found was only the tip of the iceberg, and she needed more information if she was going to piece together the full picture. Her opportunity came sooner than expected. That afternoon, while Victoria and Lila were out shopping and Charles was locked in his study, Clara saw Matthew slip into the garage. Curious, she followed at a distance, careful to remain out of sight. From the doorway, she watched as he climbed into a sleek black sports car and pulled out of the driveway. Clara hesitated for only a moment before making her way to the staff parking lot. She drove carefully, keeping a safe distance as she tailed Matthew into the city. He made several turns, his route seemingly aimless, before finally pulling into the lot of a nondescript office building. Clara parked across the street and watched as he disappeared inside. She waited, her heart pounding, for nearly an hour before he emerged, a leather briefcase in hand. This time, his movements were more deliberate. He drove to a cafe a few blocks away, where he met a man Clara didn't recognize. From her vantage point in the car, Clara observed the exchange. The two men spoke briefly, their conversation tense. At one point, the man handed Matthew an envelope, which he tucked into his jacket with a nod. Clara's stomach twisted with unease. Whatever Matthew was involved in, it was bigger than she'd imagined. That evening, back at the mansion, Clara found herself alone in the kitchen. The rest of the staff had retired for the night, and the house was unusually quiet. She sat at the small wooden table in the corner, her notebook open before her. By the soft light of the overhead lamp, she began writing, her pen moving quickly across the page. Matthew Aldridge, offshore accounts. Possible embezzlement? Meeting with unknown associate in city. Envelope exchanged. Victoria Aldridge, escalating tension with Matthew. Likely connected to financial irregularities. She paused, chewing on the end of her pen as she considered her next move. The Aldridges were unraveling, and while she had no intention of interfering directly, she couldn't ignore the implications of what she discovered. The pieces were falling into place, and the picture they painted was damning. As she closed her notebook, a thought struck her. The note she had found in the dining room days earlier, "He knows more than he should. Handle it," had taken on a new significance. Was it meant for Matthew? Or was someone else pulling the strings? The question swirled in Clara's mind as she prepared to head upstairs. But as she reached for the light switch, she heard a noise that made her freeze. Footsteps, slow and deliberate, echoed down the hallway. Clara's heart leapt into her throat. She turned, her eyes scanning the darkened kitchen. "Who's there?" she called, her voice steady despite the fear clawing at her chest. No answer came, but the footsteps continued, growing fainter as they moved away. Clara waited until the silence returned before exhaling shakily. Whoever it was, they had come close, too close. She made her way upstairs, her thoughts racing. The web of secrets was tightening, and she was caught in the middle. But Clara was no stranger to dangerous games. She had played them before, and she intended to win. As she lay in bed that night, listening to the faint creak of the house settling, Clara's resolve hardened. The Aldridge family's world was unraveling, and she would be there to witness every thread come loose. But more than that, she would ensure their secrets saw the light of day. For Clara, this was more than just a job. It was justice. The morning air in the Aldridge mansion was cold and still, the kind of quiet that settled like a thick fog before a storm. Clara Hastings, as always, was up before the rest of the household. The sun had barely begun to rise, its weak light casting long shadows through the tall windows. She moved with practiced precision, her footsteps silent against the marble floors as she set out fresh flowers in the dining room. But today wasn't like any other day. Clara could feel it, a palpable tension in the air, like a taut string about to snap. Her mind was racing with everything she had uncovered over the past few days. The cryptic note, Matthew's secret meetings, the financial discrepancies. Each piece fit together, forming a picture of a family on the brink of implosion. And Clara knew that the time was nearing for her to pull back the curtain. Victoria Aldridge entered the room, her heels clicking sharply against the floor. She was dressed impeccably, as always, in a tailored cream-colored dress with pearls at her throat. But even with her flawless exterior, Clara could see the cracks. There was a tightness around her mouth, a shadow under her eyes that even her expensive concealer couldn't hide. "Good morning, Mrs. Aldridge," Clara said, her tone neutral as she straightened the flowers. Victoria barely glanced at her. "Clara, I'll need you to prepare the drawing room this afternoon. We're expecting guests." "Of course," Clara replied, her voice even. She watched Victoria out of the corner of her eye, noting the way her hands trembled slightly as she poured herself a cup of coffee. Victoria paused, her gaze lingering on the garden outside the window. "Make sure everything is perfect," she added, almost absently. "We can't afford any surprises." Clara inclined her head. "Understood." The guests began arriving promptly at 4 o'clock, a parade of sleek cars and designer handbags. The drawing room had been transformed into a vision of understated luxury, with its polished wood floors and soft cream furniture. Clara had overseen every detail, from the arrangement of the hors d'oeuvres to the placement of the fresh orchids that adorned the side tables. As the guests settled in, the Aldridge family took their places like actors on a stage. Charles, with his imposing presence and graying hair, shook hands and laughed loudly, though his eyes betrayed none of the warmth his voice implied. Victoria moved through the crowd with practiced ease, her sharp gaze scanning for weaknesses in the room's social hierarchy. Matthew lounged near the fireplace, exuding a casual arrogance that only wealth could afford. Clara observed from the shadows, her posture unassuming but her mind alert. She had been in the room earlier that afternoon, ensuring everything was in order, when she stumbled upon something unexpected. An envelope tucked beneath one of the couch cushions. Inside were photographs, grainy but unmistakable, of Charles Aldridge in a compromising position with a woman who was most certainly not Victoria. Clara hadn't been surprised. Charles's indiscretions were no secret to the staff, but this was the first concrete evidence she had seen. She had quickly replaced the envelope, her mind buzzing with the implications. Who had placed it there? And why? The party progressed with its usual blend of superficial charm and thinly veiled rivalries. Guests exchanged compliments that sounded more like barbs, their laughter loud and brittle. Clara moved through the room, refilling glasses and catching snippets of conversation. But her focus remained on the Aldridge family. Victoria, as ever, was the picture of poise. But Clara could see the strain beneath the surface. Her smiles were tight, her movements stiff. Matthew, on the other hand, seemed unusually restless. He checked his phone repeatedly, his brow furrowed in thought. And Charles looked downright uncomfortable. He avoided Victoria's gaze, his hand lingering too long on his glass of whiskey. As the evening wore on, Clara noticed a subtle shift in the atmosphere. Whispers began to ripple through the room, quiet enough to escape the notice of most, but not Clara. She caught fragments of conversations, mentions of a scandal, a potential business deal gone wrong. Her pulse quickened. Something was happening. Then, it happened. A man Clara didn't recognize, dressed in a sharp navy suit, approached Charles with a folder in hand. Their exchange was brief, the man's voice too low for Clara to hear. But she saw the way Charles's face paled as he opened the folder, his hands trembling slightly. Victoria noticed, too, her sharp eyes narrowing as she watched her husband. "Excuse me," Charles muttered, his voice tight, before hastily retreating to his study. Victoria followed moments later, her heels clicking like gunfire against the floor. Clara hesitated only briefly before slipping away from the drawing room. She moved quickly and quietly, following the sound of raised voices to the study. The door was slightly ajar, and she positioned herself just out of sight, her heart pounding. "You've humiliated me." Victoria's voice was sharp and furious. "How could you be so careless?" Charles's reply was muffled, but his tone was defensive. "You think I wanted this? It's not what it looks like. Don't lie to me." "Charles," Victoria snapped. "This could ruin us." Clara's breath caught. She leaned closer, straining to hear more. But before she could catch the next words, she heard footsteps approaching from the opposite direction. She quickly stepped back, ducking into the shadows as Matthew appeared, his expression dark. "What are you doing?" he demanded, his voice low and accusing. Clara froze, her mind racing for an explanation. "I was bringing these to the study," she said, holding up the tray of coffee cups she had carried from the kitchen earlier. Her voice was calm, her face impassive. Matthew's eyes narrowed, suspicion flickering across his face. But before he could press further, the sound of something shattering inside the study drew his attention. With a final glance at Clara, he pushed the door open and stepped inside. Clara took the opportunity to slip away, her heart pounding. She made her way back to her quarters, her thoughts racing. The Aldridge family was falling apart, and she was right in the middle of it. Later that night, as the house settled into uneasy silence, Clara sat in her small attic room, her notebook open before her. She carefully documented everything she had witnessed, her pen moving with deliberate precision. Charles Aldridge, confrontation with Victoria, evidence of affair confirmed, possible blackmail in progress. Matthew Aldridge, restlessness increasing, potential involvement in financial scandal. Clara paused, her pen hovering over the page. She thought back to the envelope she had found, the photographs inside. Someone had placed them there deliberately, but for what purpose? Was it to provoke Charles? To expose him? Or was it something more insidious? The pieces were falling into place, but the picture was far from complete. Clara knew she was running out of time. The Aldridges were on the verge of collapse, and soon, the world would see them for what they truly were. As she closed her notebook, Clara felt a flicker of satisfaction. The storm was coming, and she was ready. The evening air carried a chill that seeped through the ornate windows of the Aldridge mansion. Clara Hastings sat at the edge of her narrow bed in the attic, her notebook resting on her lap. The pages were nearly full now, dense with observations, secrets, and the slow unraveling of a powerful family. She ran her fingers over the leather cover, feeling the weight of what she had compiled. It wasn't just a collection of facts, it was a weapon, and Clara was ready to wield it. Her double life had been carefully concealed for years. To the Aldridges, she was nothing more than a housekeeper, invisible and insignificant. But beyond the confines of this household, Clara was known by another name, a name that commanded respect and curiosity in literary circles. As C. Hastings, she was a best-selling author, celebrated for her sharp, incisive novels that explored the lives of the wealthy elite with brutal honesty. Her readers assumed she relied on imagination and research to craft her tales, never realizing just how much truth lay beneath the surface. Clara had entered the Aldridge household under the guise of employment, but her true purpose had always been far more calculated. She was gathering material for her next book, one that would expose the corrupt underbelly of families like the Aldridges. It wasn't just about the scandals or the money. It was about power and the ways it corrupted everything it touched. The day had begun like any other. Clara moved through the mansion with her usual efficiency, her presence unnoticed as she carried out her duties. But beneath her calm exterior, her mind was racing. The confrontation between Charles and Victoria the night before had been a turning point. The photographs, the whispers of financial ruin, Matthew's suspicious behavior. It was all building towards something explosive. Clara just had to wait for the right moment to strike. As she dusted the grand staircase, she caught sight of Victoria descending from the second floor. The matriarch's expression was colder than usual, her lips pressed into a thin line. "Clara," Victoria said sharply, "have the library prepared for this evening. I'm hosting a private meeting, and I don't want any interruptions." Clara nodded. "Of course, Mrs. Aldridge." Victoria paused, her eyes narrowing as they settled on Clara. "And make sure the house is spotless. We can't afford any slip-ups." Clara kept her expression neutral, even as a flicker of curiosity stirred within her. Victoria was rattled, that much was clear. Whatever this meeting was about, it wasn't just another social obligation. By the time the sun dipped below the horizon, the library was immaculate. The scent of polish lingered in the air, and a fire crackled in the hearth, casting a warm glow over the mahogany furniture. Clara had set out a tray of coffee and pastries, ensuring every detail was perfect. But as she stepped back to survey her work, she noticed something unusual, a set of documents partially concealed beneath the corner of a leather-bound ledger. Her pulse quickened as she moved closer. The documents were contracts, detailing a business merger involving the Aldridge family's holdings. At first glance, it seemed like routine paperwork, but as Clara scanned the pages, a pattern began to emerge. The terms of the deal were heavily one-sided, favoring an unknown entity listed only as Blackstone Holdings. Clara's brow furrowed. She had never heard of Blackstone before, but the numbers didn't add up. It was clear that someone within the family was orchestrating something underhanded. She quickly returned the documents to their original position, her mind racing. The pieces of the puzzle were falling into place, and the picture they painted was damning. Charles and Matthew were both implicated. One through his reckless behavior, the other through his deliberate deceit. And Victoria, though always careful to maintain her image, was no innocent bystander. She was complicit, if only by her silence. Later that evening, the sound of raised voices drifted from the library. Clara lingered in the hallway, her ears straining to catch snippets of the conversation. She recognized Victoria's sharp tone, followed by the deeper rumble of Charles's voice. Matthew's interjections were louder, angrier, like a man backed into a corner. "This merger is a disaster," Victoria hissed. "Do you have any idea what this will do to our reputation if it fails?" Charles's reply was muffled, but his frustration was evident. "You think I haven't considered that? We're in too deep to back out now." Matthew's voice cut through the tension, his words laced with defiance. "We wouldn't be in this mess if you hadn't gambled away half the company's assets." There was a crash, the sound of glass shattering against the floor. Clara tensed, her fingers tightening around the tray she held. The argument continued, the voices rising and falling like waves crashing against a rocky shore. She stayed where she was, her heart pounding. Every word was another thread in the tapestry she was weaving, another revelation that would find its way into her book. When the meeting finally ended, the library was left in disarray. Clara waited until the coast was clear before stepping inside to clean. The shattered remains of a whiskey glass lay near the fireplace, and papers were strewn across the desk. Among them was a single sheet that caught Clara's attention. It was a memo, addressed to Charles, warning him of the potential consequences of the merger. The language was blunt, almost accusatory. Proceeding with this deal could lead to insolvency. Blackstone Holdings cannot be trusted. Clara's breath caught. This wasn't just a scandal. It was a ticking time bomb. If the merger went through, it would destroy the Aldridge family's financial empire. And judging by the state of the library, the family was already beginning to implode under the weight of their secrets. That night, as the mansion fell silent, Clara sat at her desk, her notebook open before her. She wrote furiously, her thoughts pouring onto the page with an urgency she hadn't felt in years. Charles Aldridge, reckless financial decisions. Blackstone Holdings likely a front for fraud. Victoria Aldridge, aware of the risks but complicit in protecting the family's image. Matthew Aldridge, direct involvement in siphoning funds. Growing volatility under pressure. She paused, her pen hovering over the page. The Aldridges were unraveling faster than she had anticipated, their carefully constructed facade crumbling under the weight of their greed and deceit. But Clara knew this was only the beginning. The real fallout would come when the truth was exposed, and she would be the one to expose it. As she closed her notebook, Clara felt a sense of satisfaction unlike anything she had ever experienced. This wasn't just about the Aldridges. It was about justice, about holding the powerful accountable for their actions. For too long, families like the Aldridges had operated with impunity, their wealth shielding them from the consequences of their choices. But Clara was determined to change that. The storm outside had long since passed, but within the Aldridge mansion, another storm was brewing. One that Clara intended to unleash. She had spent months gathering the threads, and now, it was time to pull them tight. The Aldridge estate had always stood as a symbol of prestige and unshakable power. Its towering columns and sprawling gardens seemed to proclaim invincibility, but beneath the grandeur, everything was crumbling. Clara Hastings moved quietly through the house that morning, her mind heavy with the weight of what she knew. The Aldridges were living on borrowed time, and the collapse of their empire was no longer a question of if, but when. Clara's notebook had become her constant companion, its pages now brimming with secrets that could dismantle the Aldridge legacy. The tension in the house had reached a fever pitch, with each member of the family caught in their own web of lies and betrayals. Clara, ever the silent observer, watched as the cracks deepened, her resolve growing stronger with each passing day. The first signs of the family's unraveling came that afternoon, during what was supposed to be a routine meeting in the drawing room. Charles Aldridge had summoned his wife and children, his tone uncharacteristically sharp. Clara lingered in the hallway just beyond the door, her ear tuned to the rising voices inside. "You've jeopardized everything?" Charles's voice boomed, the sound carrying through the mansion. "Do you have any idea what you've done?" "I jeopardized it?" Matthew shot back, his voice thick with defiance. "You're the one who's been siphoning funds into Blackstone. You've made us vulnerable to every vulture in the market." Victoria's voice cut through the argument like a blade, cold and precise. "Enough, both of you. We need to present a united front. If the press catches wind of this, they already have," Charles interrupted, his voice grim. "The Times is running a story tomorrow. I received a call from their financial desk this morning. Someone leaked the merger documents." Clara's breath caught. The leak had come sooner than she anticipated. She had suspected the family's dealings would eventually reach the public, but she hadn't expected the news to break so abruptly. Still, this was exactly what she had been waiting for. The first domino had fallen. Inside the drawing room, the argument escalated. Accusations flew back and forth, each one more damning than the last. Clara could hear the desperation in their voices, the thin veneer of control giving way to panic. For the first time, the Aldridges were being forced to confront the consequences of their actions, and it was tearing them apart. By the time the meeting ended, the house was a battlefield. Victoria stormed off to her private quarters, her heels clicking angrily against the marble floor. Charles retreated to his study, slamming the door behind him, while Matthew disappeared into the garage, presumably to escape the chaos. Clara watched them scatter, her expression calm but her mind racing. The fallout was only beginning, and she needed to stay ahead of it. That evening, as the family attempted to carry on with a facade of normalcy, Clara received an unexpected summons to Victoria's room. She knocked lightly on the door before entering, finding the matriarch seated at her vanity. Victoria's face was pale, her makeup carefully applied but unable to mask the exhaustion etched into her features. "Clara," Victoria said, her voice unusually subdued. "I need you to deliver something for me." She handed Clara a sealed envelope, her fingers trembling slightly. Take this to the office of Reynolds and Avery first thing in the morning. It's urgent. Clara nodded, tucking the envelope into her pocket. Of course, Mrs. Aldridge. Victoria hesitated, her eyes meeting Clara's in the mirror. For a brief moment, Clara thought she saw something human beneath the icy exterior. A flicker of vulnerability, of fear. But then it was gone, replaced by the familiar mask of control. That will be all, Victoria said, turning back to her reflection. Clara left the room, her mind buzzing with questions. The envelope felt heavier than it should have, its contents a mystery that demanded to be solved. She made her way to her attic room, closing the door behind her before carefully unsealing the envelope. Inside, she found a single sheet of paper, a letter addressed to Reynolds and Avery, instructing them to transfer the family's remaining assets into a private account overseas. Clara's stomach turned. This wasn't a simple financial move. It was an act of desperation. Victoria was trying to shield what little remained of the Aldridge fortune, preparing for the inevitable collapse. Clara returned the letter to its envelope, her mind racing. She would deliver it as instructed, but not before making a copy for herself. Every piece of the puzzle mattered, and this one was critical. The next morning, the estate was eerily quiet. The usual hum of activity had been replaced by a heavy stillness, as though the house itself was holding its breath. Clara completed her tasks with her usual efficiency, but her thoughts were elsewhere. The copy of Victoria's letter was tucked safely in her notebook, another thread in the tapestry she was weaving. By midday, the storm that had been brewing finally broke. News of the Aldridge family's financial troubles hit the headlines. The story splashed across the front page of the Times. Clara watched from the corner of the kitchen as the staff whispered among themselves, their voices low and anxious. The once unshakable Aldridge name was now a source of scandal, their carefully curated image shattered in an instant. Victoria spent the day in her room, refusing to see anyone. Charles locked himself in his study, emerging only to make frantic phone calls. Matthew was nowhere to be found, his absence a glaring reminder of the family's fractured state. Clara moved through the chaos with quiet purpose, her presence unnoticed as she gathered the final pieces of her story. That evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, Clara made her way to the library. The room was empty, the fire in the hearth reduced to a pile of glowing embers. She sat at the desk, her notebook open before her. The events of the past few days had been a whirlwind, but they had given her everything she needed. Clara wrote furiously, her pen moving across the page with deliberate strokes. Every detail, every revelation was committed to paper. The financial scandals, the betrayals, the cracks in the family's foundation. It was all there, laid bare for the world to see. When she finally set her pen down, the notebook was full, its contents a damning indictment of the Aldridge family. She leaned back in her chair, exhaling slowly. The story was complete, but her work was far from over. Clara had spent months preparing for this moment, and now it was time to act. The manuscript would be sent to her publisher under her pseudonym, ensuring her anonymity. The Aldridges would never know who had exposed them, but the world would know the truth. As Clara sat in the dimly lit library, the weight of her choices settled over her. She had entered the Aldridge household with a purpose, and she had fulfilled it. But the cost of her actions was not lost on her. The family she had dismantled, for all their flaws, was still human. They would suffer, and their lives would never be the same. But Clara believed it was a necessary reckoning. Justice demanded it. The fire in the hearth crackled softly, the embers glowing brighter for a moment before fading into ash. Clara closed her notebook and stood, her resolve unshaken. The fall of the Aldridges was inevitable, and she had played her part in ensuring it. Now, it was time for the world to see the truth. The day Clara Hastings walked out of the Aldridge mansion, the air was crisp with the promise of change. The sun rose high in a pale blue sky, its light glinting off the marble steps as she descended with a single suitcase in hand. Behind her, the estate stood as it always had, grand, imposing, and hollow. But for Clara, it was no longer a place of servitude. It was a chapter closed, its secrets left to unravel without her. The fallout from the Aldridge scandal had been swift and devastating. In the days following the publication of the exposé, the family's carefully curated image crumbled beneath the weight of public scrutiny. Clara had watched from the sidelines as headlines screamed of financial fraud, blackmail, and the collapse of a dynasty. The Aldridge Empire unmasked. One headline read. Another declared, "From riches to ruin, the secrets of Ravenswood's elite." Clara's book had been the catalyst. Published under her pseudonym, C. Hastings, it had taken the literary world by storm. Critics hailed it as a masterpiece, a searing indictment of privilege and corruption. But while the world marveled at her sharp prose and fearless storytelling, no one could have guessed just how deeply she had been entrenched in the story she told. As she walked away from the mansion, Clara felt a strange mix of emotions. Relief, yes, but also a lingering sadness. Despite everything, she had seen glimpses of humanity in the Aldridges, moments of vulnerability that hinted at what might have been, had their lives not been consumed by greed and ambition. She thought of Victoria, clinging desperately to her dignity even as her world fell apart. Of Charles, pacing his study with the weight of failure etched into his features. Of Matthew, defiant to the end, yet haunted by his own missteps. And then there was Lila. The youngest Aldridge, so often overlooked in the chaos, had been the only member of the family to show Clara any genuine kindness. In the final days before the scandal broke, Lila had sought Clara out, her eyes wide with fear. "I don't know what to do," she had whispered, her voice trembling. "Everything's falling apart." Clara had wanted to offer comfort, to tell her that things would be okay. But she couldn't lie. Instead, she had squeezed Lila's hand and said the only thing that felt honest. "You'll find your way. You're stronger than you think." Clara's destination that morning was a small cafe on the outskirts of the city, a quiet place where she often went to write. She settled into her usual corner table, a steaming cup of coffee in front of her, and her notebook open to a fresh page. For the first time in months, the pages were blank, unmarked by the secrets of others. It was a liberating sight. As she began to write, her thoughts drifted to the events that had led her here. She remembered the first day she had walked into the Aldridge mansion, her nerves carefully masked by a polite smile. She had known from the start that it wouldn't be easy. The family's wealth and power made them untouchable in the eyes of most. But Clara had learned long ago that even the mightiest could fall, given the right push. Her push had come in the form of a story that demanded to be told, no matter the cost. Clara had spent months weaving together the threads of the Aldridges' lives, documenting every lie, every betrayal, every crack in their polished veneer. It had been a painstaking process, but it was worth it. The truth was out, and there was no taking it back. By midday, the cafe had filled with the hum of conversation, the clinking of cups, and the rustle of newspapers. Clara's attention was drawn to a man seated a few tables away, his nose buried in the day's edition of the Times. She caught a glimpse of the headline, "Aldridge Scandal Deepens. New Revelations Emerge." The man frowned as he read, shaking his head in disapproval. "It's shocking, isn't it?" he said to his companion. "To think people like that could get away with so much for so long." His companion nodded. "Makes you wonder how many more are out there, hiding behind their wealth." Clara smiled faintly, her eyes returning to her notebook. The world was finally asking the right questions. The rest of the afternoon passed in a blur of words and thoughts. Clara's pen moved steadily, the familiar rhythm of writing soothing her frayed nerves. By the time the sun began to dip below the horizon, she had filled several pages with ideas for her next project. It wouldn't be another exposé, not yet, at least. She needed time to process, to rediscover her voice outside the chaos of the Aldridge saga. As she gathered her things and prepared to leave, her phone buzzed with a notification. It was an email from her publisher, a congratulatory message about the success of her book, along with an offer for her next manuscript. Clara read it quickly, her lips curving into a small smile. The world might not know her true identity, but her words had made an impact, and that was enough. Clara's journey home took her through the city streets, the glow of streetlights casting long shadows on the pavement. She felt a sense of peace she hadn't known in months, a weight lifted from her shoulders. The Aldridge chapter of her life was over, and for the first time in a long while, she felt free. Her new apartment was modest but cozy, a far cry from the opulence of the Aldridge estate. She stepped inside, setting her bag on the kitchen counter and kicking off her shoes. The quiet was a welcome change, a space to breathe and think without the constant pressure of watching and being watched. As she poured herself a glass of wine and settled onto the couch, Clara allowed herself to reflect on what she had accomplished. The Aldridges might never recover from the scandal, but that wasn't her concern. Her goal had never been to destroy them. It had been to reveal the truth, to hold a mirror up to a world that thrived on deception and privilege. She thought back to the final words of her book, the message she had hoped would resonate with readers. The powerful often believe themselves untouchable, their secrets buried beneath layers of wealth and influence. But the truth has a way of surfacing, no matter how deeply it's hidden. And when it does, it's not just their world that changes, it's ours too. Clara raised her glass in a silent toast to herself, to the journey she had undertaken, and to the future she was finally free to embrace. The Aldridges had fallen, but she was just beginning to rise. As the night stretched on, Clara returned to her desk, her fingers itching to write again. The blank page before her was filled with possibilities, each one more exciting than the last. For the first time in months, her story was her own, and she couldn't wait to tell it.